The steady hum of the aircraft blended seamlessly with the quiet murmurs of passengers settling into their seats. The soft clinking of glasses echoed as flight attendants prepared for takeoff, and the faint rustling of newspapers filled the air. In the heart of the first-class cabin, where exclusivity and comfort were expected, an elderly black man adjusted himself in his seat. His movements were slow yet deliberate, his gaze drifting calmly across the cabin, taking in his surroundings. Beside him, Vivian Lancaster let out a sharp exhale, shifting in her seat as though his very presence had unsettled her carefully curated travel experience. Dressed in an expensive designer ensemble, her manicured fingers tapped impatiently against the armrest. Her expression hardened with each passing second. To her, first class wasn't just a service. It was a statement, a declaration of status, an unspoken assurance that she would be surrounded by the right kind of people. But today, that expectation had been shattered. At first, she responded the way people like her always did, with subtle but unmistakable displays of disdain. A pointed glance, a heavy sigh. The deliberate way she angled her body, creating as much distance as possible, as if merely sitting beside this man was beneath her. But when that wasn't enough, when he remained undisturbed by her passive hostility, she escalated. Her words became sharper, her actions bolder. And with every passing moment, she chipped away at his dignity, fully confident that no one would stop her. And she was right. The flight attendants hesitated, uneasy but unwilling to intervene. The other passengers glanced up briefly before quickly looking away, choosing silence over confrontation. He was alone, surrounded by people who had decided he was not their problem. What Vivian Lancaster failed to consider, what she never even imagined, was that every insult, every condescending remark, and every cruel display of entitlement was pushing her toward a reckoning. She believed she was untouchable. She assumed he was powerless. She had no idea who he really was. And by the time she realized, it would be far too late. Would you have spoken up? Or would you have remained silent like the others? Where are you watching from? Comment below, like, and subscribe for more powerful stories that prove why the truth always prevails. Vivian Lancaster strutted into the first-class cabin as if she owned the entire airline. The sharp click of her designer heels against the polished floor announced her arrival. With precise movements, she adjusted the luxurious silk scarf draped over her shoulders, exuding an air of confidence. But it wasn't the confidence of self-assurance. No, hers was the confidence of entitlement, the belief that the world should cater to her whims, that anything less than absolute deference was an insult to her status. She paused at the entrance of the cabin, her gaze sweeping across the passengers with a practiced sneer. She evaluated them, mentally sorting who belonged and who in her mind clearly did not. As she pulled off her oversized sunglasses, her eyes landed on an elderly black man seated near the window, her lips curled in distaste. He was dressed neatly, his suit well-maintained but showing signs of age, the kind of attire that suggested he had once been someone important, but in her eyes had long since faded into irrelevance. Vivian scoffed, muttering under her breath just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. First class just isn't what it used to be. At the front of the cabin, a young flight attendant named Rachel Hayes caught sight of Vivian's expression and immediately braced herself. She had dealt with passengers like her before. Entitled, demanding, always on the lookout for something to complain about. Forcing on her most professional smile, Rachel stepped forward. "Good afternoon, Miss Lancaster. Welcome aboard. May I assist you with your seat?" Vivian barely acknowledged her. With an air of impatience, she waved her off. "I know where my seat is," she snapped, stepping forward with deliberate elegance. But as she reached her designated seat, her expression shifted. She froze as she realized who she'd be sitting beside. The elderly man sat calmly, flipping through a newspaper, seemingly oblivious to her growing irritation. Her jaw tightened. She turned sharply to Rachel, her voice dripping with condescension. "Is this some kind of mistake?" Rachel frowned. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Vivian gestured toward the elderly man without even looking at him. "Him? Are you sure he's supposed to be here?" Rachel's stomach twisted. "Yes, ma'am. His ticket is confirmed for first class, just like yours." Vivian crossed her arms, scoffing in disbelief. "I find that hard to believe." Her voice carried just enough volume to ensure nearby passengers heard her. First class used to be exclusive. Now it seems like just anyone can get in. Theo Bennett slowly turned his head, his gaze meeting Vivian Lancaster with quiet patience. He didn't react to her words, didn't flinch under her scrutiny. Instead, he simply folded his newspaper with care and offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon, ma'am." Vivian ignored him entirely. She turned to Rachel Hayes, her voice sharp with entitlement. "I want a different seat." Rachel hesitated. She knew exactly where this was going. "I'm sorry, Miss Lancaster, but first class is full. There are no other available seats." Vivian let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking her head as if she had just been handed devastating news. "You can't be serious. You expect me to sit next to—" She trailed off, lips pursing as if the thought alone was unbearable. She squared her shoulders. "Fine. But if he causes any problems, I expect you to move him." Rachel bit her tongue and gave a tight nod. "Let me know if you need anything." She turned away quickly, knowing full well that this wouldn't be the last time Vivian Lancaster had something to say before takeoff. Vivian dropped into her seat with a dramatic exhale, as if she were enduring some great burden. She slid her expensive handbag off her shoulder and carelessly tossed it onto the seat between them, its edge overlapping Theo's armrest. If she expected him to move or complain, he didn't. Instead, Theo simply adjusted his posture slightly and returned to his newspaper, his expression composed, unbothered. That only irritated Vivian more. As passengers continued boarding, she pulled out her phone, her manicured fingers flying across the screen. She sent a message to one of her equally pretentious friends. "First class is going downhill, sitting next to some old man who clearly doesn't belong. I swear, they'll let anyone in these days." Every so often she cast glances at him, waiting for him to do something, anything that would confirm her belief that he didn't belong here. But he remained still, calm, unshaken. And perhaps that was the greatest insult of all. He wasn't intimidated by her. He wasn't seeking her approval. He wasn't reacting the way she expected. The engines hummed as the last passengers settled in. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, performing their final checks. Vivian stole one last look at the man beside her and rolled her eyes. "This is going to be a long flight." She sighed loudly, shifting in her seat as though the very act of sitting beside him was exhausting. Then, without a word, she lifted her oversized designer handbag and dropped it onto Theo's lap. The weight of it landed heavily against his stomach. He let out a slight, startled breath, his hands hesitating before he carefully lifted the bag and placed it back onto the seat between them. Vivian's eyes snapped to him. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, her tone sharp. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "I just thought—" Vivian scoffed. "That was your first mistake." She grabbed the bag and shoved it back onto his lap. "You hold it. I don't want it on the floor." His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted its position so it wouldn't press too hard against his ribs. He nodded once, avoiding her gaze. Vivian smirked. No one interfered. The surrounding passengers either pretended not to hear or simply chose to do nothing. That silence, that lack of resistance, fueled her. She stretched out her legs, turning toward him with feigned curiosity. "So what's your deal? Retired? Let me guess, factory worker? Or were you one of those guys standing outside of a gas station with a sign that says, 'Need work'?" Theo's grip tightened around the handbag, but he didn't respond. His lips pressed into a thin line, his posture stiffening slightly. Vivian grinned. "Oh, come on, don't get shy now. What did you used to do?" The old man swallowed hard. "I worked in—" Vivian cut him off. "Let me guess, bus driver?" She let out a snicker. "Or were you one of those people wiping down tables at a diner for tips?" A passenger a few rows away coughed awkwardly. Still, no one intervened. Theo's face flushed slightly. His fingers curled around the handbag strap, his shoulders tense. Slowly, he turned his head, his weary eyes searching for Rachel, the flight attendant. His expression wasn't defiant. It was pleading. "Help me." Rachel hesitated for half a second. Then she looked away. Vivian's smirk widened. No one was going to stop her. She leaned in, lowering her voice just enough so only Theo could hear. "You don't belong here." Theo Bennett exhaled shakily. His breathing was uneven, and for a moment it looked as though he might say something. But instead, he simply lowered his head. And Vivian Lancaster smiled. Vivian Lancaster sat back, savoring the moment, the smirk on her lips barely concealed. "Rachel," she called sweetly. The young flight attendant stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Miss Lancaster?" Vivian gestured lazily toward Theo Bennett. "Are you sure he's supposed to be here?" Rachel's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She hesitated before forcing a tight-lipped smile. "His ticket is valid," Vivian scoffed, shaking her head. "That's not what I meant. First class has standards, doesn't it?" She raised an eyebrow, waiting. Rachel hesitated, her posture stiff. Then, finally, she said nothing. Vivian turned back to Theo, her smirk widening. "See?" she murmured. "Even she knows you don't belong here." The elderly man's fingers trembled as he gripped the armrest. His gaze was fixed on the seat in front of him, his face drained of color. He looked tired, defeated. And that was exactly what Vivian Lancaster wanted. She smiled in satisfaction. "Rachel, I want another seat." Rachel's voice was tight. "I'm sorry, Miss Lancaster, but first class is full." Vivian rolled her eyes, exhaling dramatically. "Fine. But if he so much as breathes too loudly, I expect you to move him." Rachel nodded stiffly and walked away. Vivian tapped her manicured fingers against the armrest, feeling a flicker of irritation. The old man was too quiet, too passive. He had barely spoken, barely defended himself, just sat there as if accepting his place beneath her. That should have satisfied her. But it didn't. It wasn't enough. Her gaze drifted to the neatly folded newspaper in his hands. Without warning, she snatched it from him. Then, before he could react, she tore it in half. The sharp, unforgiving sound of ripping paper filled the air. Theo's frail hands froze midair, as if unsure of what to do. His lips parted slightly, his eyes darting between the shredded remains of his paper. Vivian smirked. "Oops, clumsy me." She let the torn pages fall to the floor, brushing off imaginary dust from her fingers. "You probably weren't reading anything important anyway. What was it? Coupons? Obituaries?" She scoffed. "Figures." The old man didn't move. His eyes, filled with something unreadable, flickered for a moment before lowering to his lap. His fingers twitched slightly, as if resisting the urge to reach for the scattered scraps. Vivian leaned back with exaggerated ease, adjusting herself in her seat. Then suddenly, she slammed her seat backward. There was a sickening thud as the impact crushed into Theo's knees. A sharp inhale escaped him. His hands gripped the armrest tightly, his knuckles turning white. He didn't cry out. He didn't protest, but the pain was obvious in the way his legs tensed, in the slight trembling of his fingers. Vivian turned her head slightly, her lips curling in mock surprise. "Oh, sorry," she said, though she made no effort to adjust her seat. "Did that hurt? You should really keep your legs out of the way. This is first class, not a public bus." Theo pressed his lips together, his breathing unsteady. Vivian chuckled under her breath. She could see it now, his discomfort, his humiliation, his exhaustion. He was trying to stay composed. She was slowly breaking him down. Across the aisle, a man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping anxiously against his tray table. A woman in the row ahead peeked over her shoulder, her gaze lingering for a second before she turned away. But still, no one said a word. No one did anything. Rachel stood a few rows away, her posture stiff, her hands clasped tightly together. She saw everything, but she didn't move. Vivian let out a soft, victorious sigh. This was control. She stretched out her arms, then kicked her foot forward, lightly nudging Theo's shoe. His reaction was immediate. His hands clenched into fists for a brief moment, then just as quickly he forced them to relax. Vivian grinned. "Relax," she said, her voice coated with fake amusement. "It's just a little space issue. But you wouldn't know about that, would you? I bet you've never had this much legroom before." Theo remained silent, but his breathing had changed. It was uneven now. Vivian tilted her head, studying him like a predator watching wounded prey. Rachel took a small step forward as if debating whether to intervene. Vivian caught the movement immediately. She turned to her, her voice sweet but with a dangerous edge. "Rachel?" Rachel hesitated. "Yes, Miss Lancaster?" Vivian placed a hand dramatically over her chest. "I feel a little cramped. Is there another seat available? Somewhere more comfortable?" Rachel hesitated again, shifting awkwardly on her feet. "I'm sorry, ma'am. First class is full." Vivian clicked her tongue, feigning disappointment. "That's unfortunate. Well, I hope he understands that I need my space. After all, I paid for it." Theo's shoulders sank slightly. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the seat. Vivian smirked. She had all the power in this moment. And yet, it still wasn't enough. Vivian Lancaster clicked her tongue in mock disappointment. That's unfortunate. Well, I hope he understands that I need my space. After all, I paid for it. She watched as Theo Bennett's shoulders sank slightly, his posture shrinking inward. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the seat. Vivian smirked. She reached for her phone and snapped a picture. Just documenting my flight experience, she murmured, her voice dripping with amusement. I'm definitely leaving a review. Theo turned his face away. But it didn't matter. She had already taken the photo. Vivian leaned back in her seat, casually scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. She had humiliated him, hurt him, and she had claimed her dominance. Yet still, he remained silent. His posture was stiff, his hands clasped tightly together as if he were holding himself together. His breathing was shallow, and he looked like he wanted to sink into the chair and disappear. But that wasn't enough. Vivian wanted to see him break. She picked up her glass of water, taking a slow sip, rolling the cool liquid over her tongue. Then, with a subtle twitch of her wrist, she let the cup slip from her fingers. It tumbled downward, tilting just enough to spill water across the floor. A few drops splattered against Theo's shoe, darkening the aged leather. The rest pooled into a small, clear puddle beside his feet. Vivian gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest. Oh no, my water spilled. Her eyes flickered toward Rachel Hayes, feigning distress. This is unacceptable. Someone could slip. Rachel's lips parted slightly. I can clean that up, ma'am. Vivian shook her head. No, I think our friend here can handle it. She turned her gaze toward Theo, her smile sickly sweet. I mean, he's just sitting there, might as well make himself useful. Theo froze. His fingers twitched slightly. His body was rigid with humiliation. Rachel hesitated, shifting her weight as if she wanted to object. But then, she glanced at Vivian's expectant expression, and she lowered her gaze. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vivian tapped her nails against the armrest, tilting her head. What's the problem? She asked, her tone mocking. I thought older folks liked keeping things neat and tidy. She gave him a pointed look. Or do you expect first-class service to cater to you? For a moment, Theo remained completely still. Then, slowly, his hands unclasped, his shoulders hunched slightly, and he leaned forward. With trembling fingers, he reached down, gripping a napkin. His hands shook as he dabbed at the water on the floor. The motion was slow, deliberate, painful. Vivian smirked. Finally. She nudged Rachel with her elbow. See? Some people just need a little motivation. Rachel's expression remained carefully blank, but she didn't move. No one did. Theo's knee strained as he wiped the puddle. His body folded inward, his head tilted downward in utter submission. Vivian let out a quiet laugh. Then, she reached for a small bag of pretzels from her tray, turning it over in her hand. With a flick of her fingers, she let it slip. The bag hit the floor beside Theo's hand. He stilled. Vivian gasped again. Oh dear, another mess. She placed a hand over her mouth, feigning concern. Since you're already down there, why don't you take care of that too? Theo's shoulders tensed. His fingers clenched around the napkin. His breathing was shaky, uneven. But he didn't move. Vivian clicked her tongue. Come on, it's just a few crumbs. Her voice was teasing. You wouldn't want to leave a mess behind, would you? A choked silence filled the space between them. Theo's head lowered even further. And then, finally, he reached for the bag. Vivian's grin stretched wider. Rachel turned her face away. The humiliation was complete. But Vivian wasn't done. She leaned in slightly, her voice a hushed whisper meant only for him. See? This is where you belong. Theo gripped the armrest as he slowly sat back up, his shoulders shaking slightly. Vivian sat back fully satisfied. She lifted her phone again and snapped another picture. She had won. But just as she was about to type another cruel message, she felt something shift. She glanced up. Her gaze swept across the cabin. The passengers were still silent, still passive, but something was different. There was tension now, something lingering in the air. Vivian's gaze flickered toward the front of the plane. Rachel was speaking with another flight attendant, her expression unreadable. Vivian leaned back, watching Theo Bennett with amusement. He had cleaned the mess she made. He had endured. But for the first time, something felt off, and she wasn't sure why. Vivian Lancaster had already humiliated him. She had thrown insults, stripped him of his dignity, and forced him into submission. But it wasn't enough. She wanted to see real defeat. Her gaze flickered toward Theo Bennett's face, taking note of how he squinted slightly, struggling to focus on the seat in front of him. Then, she noticed them. Thin, old-fashioned glasses perched delicately on his nose. A slow smirk curled her lips. Without hesitation, she snatched them off his face. Theo flinched, his breath hitching. His hands instinctively reached for the empty space where his glasses had been. "Please," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need those." Vivian twirled the glasses between her fingers, inspecting them as if they were some cheap trinket. "Wow, these are ancient. Do they even make frames like this anymore?" She held them up to the cabin lights, pretending to examine them. Theo's eyes followed the movement desperately, but his vision was blurred, unfocused, lost. He reached forward cautiously, his fingers stretching toward them. But Vivian leaned away, keeping the glasses just out of reach. "Oh, you really do need them, huh?" she mused, her tone thick with amusement. "That's kind of sad." She tilted her head, mocking sympathy. "I don't know, though. They don't really fit the whole first-class aesthetic." She smirked. "They make you look poor." Before he could say another word, she tossed the glasses into the aisle. They skidded across the floor. And then, a flight attendant stepping forward brought her heel down directly on them. A soft, sickening crunch filled the air. The sound was quiet, but final. Theo froze. His hands hovered mid-air, his lips slightly parted. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what had just happened. His body tensed, his fingers curling into fists, then slowly unclenching. His breathing became uneven, shaky. Vivian let out a dramatic gasp, placing a hand over her mouth. "Oh no, that was an accident, I swear." She pressed her lips together, fighting back laughter. "You probably weren't using them for anything important, right?" Theo didn't respond. His shoulders slumped, his head lowered slightly, as if trying to hold himself together. Across the aisle, Rachel Hayes hesitated before stepping forward. Carefully, she bent down and picked up what remained of the glasses. The frames were bent beyond repair. The lenses cracked to pieces. Rachel glanced at Theo, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something. Then, she looked at Vivian. Vivian raised an eyebrow expectantly. Rachel's shoulders stiffened. She exhaled slowly and turned away. Vivian smirked. Theo was now completely vulnerable. He couldn't see properly, couldn't read, couldn't even look around without the world becoming an indistinct blur. He just sat there, silent, staring down at his lap, his face pale. Vivian reached for her phone and snapped another picture. "That's a shame," she said, tucking her phone away. "You should be more careful with your things." Theo's fingers twitched slightly, but he still didn't speak. Vivian let out a long, exaggerated sigh and leaned back. She had won. And yet, something felt different. She could sense it in the air. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Something had changed. She glanced up, scanning the row ahead. Passengers still sat quietly. Still avoided eye contact, yet there was something unnatural about the stillness now. Rachel was whispering to another flight attendant. Her movements stiff. A businessman, 2 rows ahead, no longer pretended to read his tablet. His gaze lingered on Vivian, just a second longer than before. Vivian crossed her legs, letting out a dramatic sigh as she turned to Rachel. "All right, I've been more than patient, but this arrangement isn't working for me." Her voice was laced with irritation. "I need my space, and frankly, I shouldn't have to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong here." Rachel's jaw tightened slightly. "Ms. Lancaster," she said carefully, "I've already informed you that first class is full. There are no other seats available." Vivian gave a slow, condescending smile. "Oh, I know that." She leaned in slightly. "But I wasn't talking about me." She flicked a lazy hand toward Theo. "I was talking about him." The old man stirred slightly, his hands tightening around the edge of his seat. Without his glasses, the world around him was blurred, disorienting. Rachel hesitated, glancing toward the front of the cabin. "Ms. Lancaster, that's not how seating arrangements work. He has a first-class ticket." Vivian scoffed, shaking her head. "And I'm a paying first-class passenger who expects a certain level of comfort." She leaned in, her voice low. "I don't think you want me filing a complaint, do you?" Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned to Theo, exhaling slowly. "Sir, would you be willing to move to another seat in economy?" Theo's body tensed. his fingers curled slightly, his breathing uneven. I have a ticket for this seat. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. I understand, sir, but it might be more comfortable for everyone if... Vivian cut in. Oh, stop acting like this is a debate, just do it already. Theo turned slightly, his unfocused eyes searching for something. Any sign of resistance, any hint of support. But there was nothing. No one moved. No one spoke up. Passengers averted their gazes. A businessman busied himself with his laptop. A woman in the row ahead adjusted her air vent. No one wanted to get involved. A deep breath rattled in Theo's chest. Slowly, his fingers released their grip on the armrest. Vivian tapped her nails against the tray table. Impatiently. With great effort, Theo reached for his cane. His movement was slow, strained. His back hunched slightly as he pushed himself upright. Without his glasses, the world was unstable. A blurred, unfamiliar haze. He had to pause for a moment, steadying himself. Vivian rolled her eyes. You're taking too long. Rachel stepped forward. Sir, let me assist. No, Theo murmured, voice barely audible. I can manage. He took a step forward, and the cabin watched in silence. Vivian Lancaster lowered her voice, her tone dripping with entitlement. And I'm a valued first-class passenger who spends good money flying this airline. I don't think you want me lodging a complaint, do you? Rachel Hayes' lips pressed into a thin line. She turned toward Theo Bennett, exhaling slowly. Sir, would you be willing to move to another seat in economy? Theo's body tensed. His fingers curled slightly, his breathing uneven. I have a ticket for this seat. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. I understand, sir, but it might be more comfortable for everyone if... Vivian cut in sharply. Oh, stop acting like this is a debate. Just do it already. Theo turned slightly, his unfocused eyes searching. For something. For someone. Any sign of resistance, any hint of support. But there was nothing. No one moved. No one spoke up. Passengers averted their gazes. A businessman busied himself with his laptop. A woman in the row ahead adjusted her air vent. No one wanted to get involved. A deep breath rattled in Theo's chest. Slowly, his fingers released their grip on the armrest. Vivian tapped her nails against the tray table impatiently. With great effort, Theo reached for his cane. His movement was slow, strained, his back hunched slightly as he pushed himself upright. Without his glasses, the world was unstable, a blurred, unfamiliar haze. He had to pause for a moment, steadying himself. Vivian rolled her eyes. You're taking too long. Rachel took a step forward. Sir, let me assist. No, Theo murmured, voice barely audible. I can manage. He took a step forward. His foot wavered slightly. For a brief moment, it seemed as though his knees might buckle. His fingers trembled as they tightened around the cane. He moved carefully, too slowly, as if each step required every ounce of his strength. Vivian let out a quiet laugh under her breath. As he stepped into the aisle, another flight attendant approached, ready to guide him toward economy. Vivian stretched her arms, settling deeper into her seat. Honestly, this flight just got so much better. Theo took another unsteady step. But, without his glasses, his depth perception failed him. His cane tapped too far ahead, his balance wavered, and then, his foot caught on the edge of a seat. His body lurched forward. A sharp gasp escaped his lips as his knee buckled completely. He collapsed. His cane clattered to the ground as his body hit the narrow aisle with a dull, sickening thud. The sound reverberated through the cabin. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a soft groan escaped Theo's lips. His body trembled as he struggled to lift himself. His hand groped blindly, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. But his world was a smear of color, and his arms too weak to support his weight. Slowly, painfully, Theo tried again. His fingers slipped against the cold floor. No one moved to help him. Vivian tilted her head, smirking. Maybe he should just stay there, she said casually. Might be the safest place for him. A few muffled coughs echoed from the surrounding seats. A man cleared his throat. But still, no one reached out. Rachel exhaled sharply, then bent down to assist him. Vivian's voice was sharp. Is this really a good use of your time? I mean, I am still waiting for another drink. Theo's hand twitched. His breath came faster, shallower. Finally, he managed to press one palm against the floor, pushing himself up inch by inch. His body trembled from the effort, his back curled inward, his movements slow and painful. After what felt like an eternity, he was on his feet again. His hand shook violently as he reached for the cane. A flight attendant had retrieved it for him. He took it, nodding slightly. He didn't speak. His humiliation was complete. Vivian let out a satisfied sigh and turned toward Rachel. Now, about that drink. Rachel opened her mouth, hesitated, then simply nodded and walked away. The old man was led toward economy. His steps were even slower now, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. He did not look back. Vivian leaned back, stretching comfortably. She adjusted her seatbelt, crossing her legs as she glanced toward the back of the plane. Theo was now settled in one of the worst seats on the aircraft, a narrow, stiff-backed chair right next to the restroom. He looked smaller there, hunched slightly, his hands resting on his lap, as if he was afraid to touch anything around him. A smug grin spread across Vivian's face. She lifted her hand and waved mockingly in his direction. Vivian Lancaster lifted her hand and waved mockingly in his direction. Hope you enjoy the view. And don't forget to say hello every time you shuffle back and forth to the bathroom. Her voice carried effortlessly through the cabin, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. But Theo Bennett gave no indication that he had heard her. He didn't move, didn't react. Vivian smirked and leaned toward the businessman seated across the aisle. She lowered her voice, but just enough to still be heard. Finally, things are back to normal. First class should be exclusive, not some free-for-all experiment. She let out a light chuckle, shaking her head. If they keep letting just anyone sit here, what's next? Free upgrades for people who look sad enough? No one responded. The businessman continued staring at his laptop, his fingers unmoving on the keyboard. A woman in the row ahead straightened her posture slightly, but she didn't turn around. Vivian leaned back in her seat, pleased with herself. Then, Rachel Hayes approached, holding a drink tray. Her movements were stiff, her grip tense as she placed a fresh glass of wine in front of Vivian. Vivian accepted it with a smirk. You know, Rachel, I think I just saved your airline from turning into a charity. She swirled the wine in her glass. If I hadn't spoken up, we'd all still be stuck sitting next to him. Rachel's expression didn't change. Is there anything else I can get for you, Miss Lancaster? Vivian tapped a manicured nail against the rim of her glass. No, I'm good. But you might want to keep an eye on him. Who knows, he might try sneaking back up here when no one's watching. Rachel exhaled slowly, gave a small nod, and walked away. Vivian settled into her seat, sipping her wine. She unlocked her phone and typed into her group chat. Mission accomplished. Got rid of the old man. First class is first class again. She locked her screen and placed the phone on her lap. The satisfaction of winning was settling in now. Then, a sharp jolt ran through the plane. Vivian's glass trembled slightly in her hand. She clicked her tongue in annoyance as a few drops of wine spilled onto a napkin. A second jolt followed, stronger than the first. Overhead, the seatbelt sign flickered on. A soft chime rang through the cabin. Then, the captain's voice came through the speakers, steady but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, the seatbelt sign is now on. We are experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Vivian adjusted her belt with an irritated sigh. Perfect. As if this flight wasn't annoying enough already. The turbulence continued, but something else caught her attention. A sound from the back of the plane, a sharp cough. At first, Vivian barely registered it. It was distant, blending into the white noise of the cabin. Then, another cough, this time more strained, more deliberate. Vivian turned her head slightly. Theo Bennett was still. But something was different now. His shoulders were tense, his breathing uneven. His hand had moved from his lap to his chest, pressing lightly against the fabric of his shirt. At the front of the cabin, Rachel, who had been securing a cart near the galley, paused. Her gaze shifted toward the back of the plane. Then, another cough. This time, a wheezing sound followed. Passengers in economy were now looking toward Theo. A flight attendant stepped forward, speaking in a low, urgent voice. Vivian tapped her fingers against the armrest, watching. Oh, what now? She muttered. Theo's breathing had become irregular. His shoulders rose and fell unevenly. His grip on the armrest tightened. His fingers trembled slightly as he struggled to take in another breath. Rachel stepped forward quickly, her tone sharper now. Sir, are you all right? Vivian frowned slightly. She wasn't concerned, but she could tell that something about the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The turbulence rattled the plane again. But this time, no one paid attention to it. All eyes were on the frail figure near the back of the plane, struggling to draw in air. A flight attendant lifted the intercom to her lips. "We need medical assistance in economy." Vivian tilted her head, watching as the situation unfolded. The tension in the air was undeniable now. Passengers whispered to one another. Rachel moved with urgency. Vivian took another sip of wine, unfazed. Let them deal with it. She had nothing to worry about, or so she thought. Vivian Lancaster's blood turned cold. Passengers twisted in their seats, their eyes flickering between the image on the screen and the frail old man struggling for breath near the restroom. At the front of the cabin, Rachel Hayes took a slow step forward, her face frozen in horror. "No," she whispered, barely audible. Vivian's chest tightened. "No, this can't be right." The businessman near the aisle looked around, his voice rising. "That's him, the chairman of the airline." His voice grew louder. "We just threw the chairman of the airline into the back row." A sharp gasp rippled through the cabin. A woman covered her mouth with both hands. Rachel whirled around and rushed down the aisle. She passed frozen passengers, past stunned faces, and dropped to her knees in front of him. "Sir, Mr. Bennett." Her voice shook. We didn't know. We had no idea." Her hands clasped together. "Please, forgive us." Vivian couldn't breathe. Theo Bennett exhaled slowly. The oxygen mask covered most of his face, but even in his weakened state, his presence dominated the room. He looked at Rachel, at her desperate, horrified expression, but he said nothing. Vivian's hands trembled. "This isn't happening." The businessman near the aisle ran a hand through his hair, still staring at the phone. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "We let that woman treat him like dirt." Vivian's stomach twisted violently. All around her, passengers were realizing the truth. The ones who had watched silently, the ones who had turned their backs, the ones who had let it happen. They all knew now. Vivian's breath came short and fast. Rachel was on her knees, begging for forgiveness. Passengers whispered. A man muttered something about legal repercussions. A woman near the window shook her head in disbelief. Then, Vivian felt it. The weight of their stares, 100 eyes turning toward her, watching, judging, her hands clenched into fists. This wasn't how the flight was supposed to go. But worst of all, this wasn't over. Her chest tightened as she watched Rachel, a once powerful flight attendant, now reduced to pleading. Around the cabin, passengers murmured. Some pulled out their phones to record. Others simply stared at Vivian, their faces a mixture of disgust and contempt. Vivian's mind raced, trying to grasp the full extent of what had just happened. But before she could process it, a sudden chime echoed through the plane's speakers. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady yet laced with an undeniable sense of urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have received an executive order from Imperial Air Headquarters." A heavy pause. Then, regarding passenger Vivian Lancaster, Vivian's heart stopped. The captain continued. "Effective immediately, Miss Lancaster is permanently banned from all domestic and international flights operating within Imperial Air." A suffocating silence filled the cabin. Then, a man a few rows ahead laughed under his breath. A woman shook her head in disbelief, muttering, "She deserves it." Vivian's fingers curled into the fabric of her seat. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But it was, and it was far from over. Rachel, regaining her composure, straightened up. She turned to Vivian, her expression cold, her voice unwavering. "Ms. Lancaster," she said, each syllable sharp. "As per company orders, you will be relocated for the remainder of this flight." Her once forced patience was gone. Now, her voice carried nothing but authority. Vivian's body refused to move. You can't do this," she stammered. She looked around, searching for support, but all she saw were blank stares and the glow of phone screens recording every second of her downfall. I have rights. I paid for this seat." Rachel didn't flinch. "And now," she said coolly, "you've lost it." Vivian's breathing grew erratic. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She needed to do something to fix this. But before she could even unlock the screen, a passenger across the aisle turned their device toward her. A breaking news alert flashed across the display. Vivian's stomach dropped. A new headline, bold, damning. HOA President Vivian Lancaster exposed. History of racial discrimination uncovered. Her vision blurred as her name flooded the screen. Notification after notification, accompanied by images of past complaints, lawsuits, dozens of testimonies from former neighbors, employees, victims of her cruelty. Then, another alert popped up. Another scandal, another resurfaced video. Vivian's pulse pounded in her ears. Someone read a tweet aloud. Her entire history is out. They found everything. The walls were closing in. Vivian Lancaster, who had always been in control, was watching her empire crumble, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Vivian Lancaster opened her mouth to protest. But Rachel Hayes didn't wait for her response. She simply gestured toward the aisle. Now. A command, not a request. Vivian's legs felt weak as she stood. The weight of 100 eyes pressed down on her. Passengers shifted to let her through, though some didn't even bother hiding their smirks. As she took a single step forward, another headline flashed across a nearby screen. Vivian Lancaster's assets frozen amid investigation. Family severs ties. Her breath caught in her throat. No, she whispered. The passenger in front of her turned their screen slightly, revealing a formal statement. It bore her family's name, their seal. And then, she read the words that sent her world crashing down. We, the Lancaster family, do not condone the actions of Vivian Lancaster. Effective immediately, we are cutting all financial and personal ties with her. We will not provide legal assistance. Her knees nearly buckled. Her family had abandoned her. A deep, suffocating panic rose in her chest. As she stumbled toward the back of the plane, forced to take the very walk of shame that she had once made Theo Bennett endure. But unlike him, no one pitied her. A flight attendant shoved her into a cramped, foul-smelling seat near the restroom. Her once pristine first-class ticket reduced to nothing but a worthless scrap of paper. She pressed a trembling hand to her forehead, trying to steady her breath. But the whispers wouldn't stop. The headlines wouldn't stop. The realization wouldn't stop. Everything she had built, her wealth, her status, her influence, gone. For the first time in her life, Vivian Lancaster had absolutely nothing. At the front of the cabin, Theo Bennett sat comfortably. He exhaled slowly, his eyes closing, finally at peace. Justice had been served. The end.